was a supervisor on the audit. The 16,000 residents that we discuss in the audit report, those are students whose qualifications fell lower on every single one of those standardized test scores, as well as the GPA scores. But if you look on...
Is it residents or non-residents?
The non-resident scores fall lower than the median for admitted residents on every single one of those scores.
Including the SAT?
Correct. So if you look on Table 6 on page 30, if you have your report in front of us, in front of you, we show you for each one of the standardized test scores and the GPA scores, the number of non-residents who were admitted whose scores fell below those for the median scores of resident students. So as we're seeing with the 16,000 students who were admitted, there's a clear trend in that the number of non-resident students whose scores fall below the median is increasing, in particular after the Compare Favorably standard was implemented.
Well, take me through this. I think I'm on page 30. I didn't graduate from a California school, so I may be impaired.
That's a shame. That is a shame.
But I'm looking at test scores or grade point averages. Test scores or grade point averages. Okay, so I'm looking at 2013, 2014. Let's pick that year in that column. And I take that column down, and I don't see anything in SAT till I get to SAT reading math. Can you sort of explain this to me? Because I'm...
Sure. So for each one of these years, these are the different academic indicators that were used to evaluate an applicant. So if you see blanks there in some of those columns, it's because those tests weren't offered or weren't used in that particular year. But if you want to look at 2013-14 for, let's say, for example, the SAT writing exam, that shows you 10,950 non-residents were admitted who had a score on that SAT writing exam that fell below the median score for admitted residents.
Okay. Well, that answers that question. Let's move to somebody else will have to provide detail or a counterpoint if there is one. Let me ask about the budget. How much was cut from the UC budget starting in the 2006-2007 timeframe? Because I wasn't here, but I believe that's when the cuts started. Is that about right?
So in the 2008-9 year, it was about $559 million. 2 years later, it was $137 million, and another year later, it was $687 million.
So over $1 billion?
Correct.
So my understanding, and this may be incorrect also, but I'll let you correct me, is that during the period 2008, 2009, continuing to 2011, maybe 2012, the California State University system, which had been similarly cut, cut somewhere between 20 to 30,000 students out of the system. Is that consistent with your understanding?
We didn't look at the CSU. We didn't do a comparative as far as the University of California to the CSU, so we don't have specific information related to the CSU.
Did you do an analysis of, I presume that some of the out-of-state tuition revenue was used, you substantiated, was used to support the in-state resident program, right?
So what the university had claimed in its operating budget for last year and the prior year was that the increased revenue from non-resident enrollment was used to bring in more California resident students. We asked the UC for a metric. You know, how many, if you bring in, a certain number of non-resident students, how many new resident students can you enroll? UC could not provide us that metric.
Did you do an analysis if you pulled out the out-of-state student tuition, rep fees, whatever we call it in California, what impact that would have had on the resident student enrollment?
We did not do that specifically. What we did do, though, is we looked at the change in resident enrollment and non-resident enrollment over the last 5 years when there was the most significant increases in non-resident enrollment. During that time period, resident enrollment fell by about 2,200 students, about a 1% drop in overall resident enrollment at the university, while at the same time, and Kathleen, help me on the numbers here.
At the same time, non-resident enrollment increased by 18,000 students. If you look at Table 15 on your handout, that's page 4. What that is showing you at the top in particular is for the flagship campuses, resident enrollment actually declined by about 5,400 students, even though during that same time period, non-resident enrollment and their associated revenue actually increased. So in those cases, the non-resident enrollment was not paying to either increase resident enrollment or even keep it flat.
So you probably testified to this, and I just missed it. If you assume resident students filled the slots that non-resident students were filling, what would the impact? It would have been a negative impact to the UC budget. What would quantify that for me? What would the negative impact have been? Was that in the report?
We didn't do that type of analysis.
I mean, that's a valid analysis, isn't it? I mean,
certainly there would be a loss in non-resident revenue, but at the same time, what we would want UC to do is to
find the money,
look internally and find cost savings.
But I mean, it would be interesting to know: is it $500 million? Is it $300 million? Is it $400 million? What's the delta? Because if they're claiming that they enrolled non-resident students, increased enrollment of non-resident students, because obviously there's some value in having people from outside your neighborhood in the university that you attend, broaden experiences, horizons, different, all that. If they're saying that they took an increased number of non-resident students to in part cover the budget shortfall that we, the legislature, and the economy forced on UC, then I think it would be interesting to know what that number is, so that we...
Is Table 10 not and I'm sorry, Senator, there's Table 10 on page 46 of your report. I don't know if that goes to the question. It's in this version of the report.
I don't know what this...
It's on page 46.
I don't have a 10. You mean in this big report?
Yeah.
I beg your pardon, Senator, for interrupting, but I was wondering if that was helpful.
If you're saying, if what we're saying, or some are saying, is find it in your budget, which is what you're saying, then I'd like to know what we're telling them to find in their budget. Is it $500 million? Is it $600 million? Is it 700? Probably not 700, because that's the total revenue, isn't it? What is it we're telling them to go find? And by the way, the state has no obligation unless we take it on for the UC pension fund, right? We have no budgetary obligation to fund their UC pension.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
There was a deal cut to help them out down, I guess, on this floor, around the corner. But that's not an obligation that we're legally obligated to pay out of the general fund. Right?
No, I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
So the Assembly member is correct. The Table 10 does show the kind of the delta and kind of the changing amount if you change the level of non-resident enrollment each year. And so what we did is that for the 14-15 year, the university was enrolling about 17%. Enrolling about 70% non-residents. If that was reduced down to a couple different levels, to the 5% level that we recommended, the level of non-resident enrollment before the latest fiscal crisis, that would be about $72 million that the university or the state would need to provide to enroll residents, a similar number of resident students.
So if they had not enrolled the out-of-state or international students, whatever they are, the increased number, the delta was $72 million a year for the university?
That's the amount of funding needed at UC's own estimate of $10,000 per resident student to bring in the equivalent number of residents.
Right, but the out-of-state tuition, isn't it like $37,000 a year? Mm-hmm. And the in-state's what?
It's $12,000.
So that's public math, $25,000, right, per student. Isn't that more than $72 million?
Correct, but what UC contends is that to enroll a resident student, it costs above the tuition amount that the resident will pay. It costs it $10,000. That's the amount that it wants to have the state kick in to enroll a resident student. So that's the delta that we were looking at.
But your report debunks the use of the $10,000 per student and says there's no real analysis behind that. So we're just using a figure that.
Well, it's a figure that the state and the UC recently agreed upon to bring in 5,000 additional students. The UC said it needed $50 million to bring in those 5,000 students. The state agreed to pay $25 million. The UC is coming up with the other $25 million. That's
right.
at $10,000 a student.
I won't monopolize the questions, Mr. Chair. I do think that some further analysis needs to be done on the real delta and what it is we're really asking them to dig out of their budget. Because somebody in a budget committee, won't be me, is going to be asking that question of them and of others. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. With that, now, members, we'll have the representatives from the UC. State Auditor, you can stay here at the table. We'll have the representatives come and sit here off to the side.
Nobody wants to go.
And give our presentation.
Sad. We better work on mercy. All right.
Yeah, representative from the UC, go ahead and introduce yourselves to us, and you can go ahead and start with your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you. Chairman Rodriguez, members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to testify today. My name is Nathan Brostrom. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at the University of California. I'm joined by Associate Vice President Stephen Handel, who's responsible for admissions issues in the Office of the President. I would first like to start by thanking you for your support of UC. The 2015 State Budget Act provided $25 million for UC to enroll an additional 5,000 more California undergraduate students than we enrolled in 2014-15. Just 2 days ago, we issued very preliminary data regarding our admissions of California freshmen. That data indicates a 15% increase in California admissions for the coming year, 8,500 more students than the number admitted last year. These numbers will certainly go up further when we announce transfer admissions 4 or 5 weeks from now. In fact, in response to the auditor's allegation about capacity, the 3 campuses with the highest enrollment of non-resident students, Berkeley, UCLA, and San Diego, will each take 750 new California residents. So along with Riverside, they will take 60% of the new California students in the fall. So we look forward to continuing to partner with you in sustaining access for California residents. Although we disagree with many of the findings in the audit, we believe that in partnership with the state, we can continue to achieve our shared goals for the benefit of California students. Let me begin by addressing the most flawed assumption in the audit. Enrollment of non-resident students has not displaced California residents. This was a financial decision and not a question of physical capacity. The revenue generated from non-resident students was a critical source that enabled us to maintain California enrollment during the fiscal crisis and ensure that our California students today have access to a high-quality UC education. The bottom line is that enrolling California resident students is our first admissions priority. Non-resident students are enrolled in addition to, not instead of, the Californians we enroll. Enrollment of California undergraduates depends on 2 things. First, our commitment to California's master plan, and second, funding from the state to support enrollment of additional students. Growth in non-resident students does not constrain the university's ability to enroll growing numbers of California resident students. The key to enrollment is state funding. Associate Vice President Handel will provide additional detail on resident and non-resident admissions. But first, I'd like to provide some context for the decisions that UC made in recent years. The onset of the fiscal crisis in 2008 dramatically reduced state revenues and forced every public agency to make difficult choices in order to address major funding shortfalls. At the university, we faced a severe reduction in revenues. At the same time, we faced a sharp increase in costs. Between 2008-9 and 2011-12, UC lost nearly a third of its state funding, about $1 billion. In response to these cuts, we have looked internally and very aggressively at all of our activities to both reduce costs and generate alternative revenues. To address the remaining shortfall, we had 3 options. First, we could have reduced California enrollment by no longer offering admission to every eligible state applicant. Second, we could have increased in-state tuition even further by an estimated additional $2,000 per student. Or third, we could have added non-residents. We chose the latter course because we believed it best allowed us to continue to support all eligible California students and provide them with an affordable, high-quality education. If UC had not increased enrollment of non-resident undergraduate students, we would not have had sufficient revenue to maintain enrollment of California students. Non-resident tuition helps us maintain access for Californians. This is not a policy that disadvantages California students. It's quite the opposite. And to the point that Mr. Roth made, Chancellor Tim White of CSU made the point recently that most of the schools in the CSU system don't attract many applicants from outside California. As a result, during the fiscal crisis, CSU made the very difficult decision to turn away tens of thousands of qualified students in order to better serve the students that they do enroll. These are the types of hard choices that public universities across the country were faced with. At UC, we saw increasing non-resident enrollment combined with achieving aggressive savings and efficiencies as the best way to maintain California enrollment and address our fiscal challenges. In fact, to the point Mr. Byer just made, we now have 9,000 more California students enrolled than we did in 2007 and 2008, before the fiscal crisis. I would also point out that continued admission of all eligible Californians has allowed us to continue progress on a goal that we all share. Display 1 in your handout shows that the number of undergraduate Pell Grant recipients, the number of first-generation undergraduates, and the percentage of students from underrepresented minority groups has climbed steadily and dramatically at UC over the last 13 years. In fact, currently, 41% of our undergraduates are Pell Grant recipients, over 40% are the first in their families to go to college, and our percentage of underrepresented minority students grew by 50% over the past decade. In fact, in the fall admissions numbers I just referenced, underrepresented minorities now represent 37.2% of our fall admissions. However, increasing non-resident enrollment was not the only financial measure we looked at to help us meet our financial challenges during the fiscal crisis. We made a lot of hard decisions. Thousands of employees were laid off, thousands of positions were eliminated, class sizes grew, and the ratio of students to faculty worsened, and we did raise tuition. I would like to specifically address the issue of staff growth in greater detail, since the auditor raised it this morning. And they may be factually correct, but it is egregiously misleading in the way it's presented and discussed. The audit cites growth in staff and salaries at the university, noting that UC employees grew by 15% between 2005 and 6 and 2014-15. This corresponds very closely with our own analysis, which shows a 15% increase between 2007 and 2015. What the audit report fails to highlight is that 72% of this growth is attributable to health sciences, driven by the dramatic growth in our medical centers. This is shown in display 2. During this time, medical center revenues and their overall operations grew by 91%, nearly doubled during that time, driving the need for more staff and the subsequent growth in salaries. I would also note that nearly 60% of UC's medical center patients are Medi-Cal, Medicare, or uninsured. The increase in personnel is a direct consequence of growing demand for our healthcare services by Californians. Another 14% of the growth came from the increase in student employees as our overall student population increased. And I would now point you to display 3, because this is what should be relevant to the state audit. In contrast, the number of staff supported by state funds and tuition, declined by 17% over this period, which is what we think is probably similar to what happened at other state and other public agencies. And that should be the most relevant factor to look at in the audit. I would also like to add, in addition to staff reductions, we also embarked on aggressive initiatives to institute new business practices, cut costs, and seek alternative sources of revenue that could help campuses meet their core mission. Some of these efforts were captured under the rubric of the Working Smarter initiative, which the auditor referenced, while others were started before that and continue on to the current day. We have, in fact, achieved savings and new revenues far greater than the $664 million referenced in that report. The audit report questions the validity of savings UC has achieved through Working Smarter and suggests they cannot be documented. Several of these initiatives, including the 4 that have generated by far the most fiscal impact, have been verified and substantiated by external parties, our own auditors, actuaries, and other third parties, which we did share with the audit team. Let me focus on one example because it generated the most amount of revenue, and that's the area of asset management. Even before the fiscal crisis, we evaluated our working capital assets, basically our operating cash, to determine if we needed as much in liquidity as we had. At that time, all of our working capital, similar to the state, was invested in the short-term investment pool, which is known as STIP. It's invested largely to ensure sufficient liquidity and ensure security. Our analysis showed that some of our assets could be moved into a new investment vehicle, the Total Return Investment Pool, known as TRIP, which is a relatively safe and secure vehicle but offers higher returns and less liquidity. This new investment opportunity has been tremendously successful. Over the past 5 years, TRIP has averaged 5.6% in returns, while STIP has averaged 1.8% returns. Since its inception, these cumulative returns have resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars of additional revenue for our campuses and medical centers. We now have a greater amount invested in TRIP than in STIP, although it's not likely we can move much more since we are close to our liquidity limitations. Again, these amounts and the returns are part of our annual audited financial statements, which have been verified by Pricewaterhouse and KPMG in every financial audit since the inception of TRIP. There are several other areas in the audit report with which the university takes exception, including questions on the pension. However, I don't intend to cover them all in my remarks. I will simply say that the university stands ready to partner with the state in achieving our common goals of increasing access, increasing affordability, and quality. Now, let me turn it over to my colleague, Steve Handel, to talk about admissions policies and practices.
Thank you, Nathan. I apologize for having you back at the audience there. Members of the committee, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you today about the University of California's undergraduate admissions policies. As you know, the State Auditor's report focuses a great deal of attention on the issue of non-resident admission to UC. Some of what I read in the report is incomplete, so this is a great opportunity, I think, to clarify some of those issues. Before I dive into the specifics of the auditor's report, let me highlight 2 main points. Very important. First, the university admits every California resident student who applies and is UC eligible. The university makes an explicit guarantee to every family in California whose son or daughter applies to UC that we will find a place for them if they meet UC's eligibility requirements. Now, this is a guarantee we take seriously. It's a guarantee that has bettered the lives of thousands of students and that we have maintained despite severe budget cuts during the fiscal crisis. And most importantly, it is a guarantee that we never extend to non-residents. Second, the university's comprehensive review admissions policy ensures that all applicants receive a thorough review of their accomplishments on a variety of criteria that look well beyond GPA and test scores. Every application UC receives is reviewed thoroughly, often multiple times by several readers. Our readers are highly trained, deeply motivated, and directed to provide what all families want for their son or daughter when they apply to college: a fair shake. That means something much more than a quick glance at a GPA and a test score. In fact, reader evaluations are based on a set of 14 academic factors that look well beyond traditional numeric markers of achievement. A grade point average and a test score, important as they are, provide only partial insight into the qualifications of students for college. UC's comprehensive review policy requires, indeed demands, that we admit students who are more than their scores. Let me now wade more deeply into the auditor's report. Time, of course, does not permit me to address every concern, so I've clustered my remarks around 3 contentions from the report that are most troubling. First, why is UC admitting non-residents when there are so many talented Californians who want to come to one of our campuses? It is true that UC has increased its admission of non-residents during a time when enrollment growth for Californians has slowed because of the absence of state enrollment funding. But the important facts are these. 85% of our enrolled students are residents. California residents are still far more likely to be admitted, both to the university and to a campus of choice. And all Californians who meet our standards receive at least one admissions offer. Now, we make this commitment despite growing demand. This year, the university received applications from over 203,000 high school and community college students, the largest number of applications in the university's 148-year history. Now, the audit report is correct in one sense. Demand for a UC education has skyrocketed. What is not properly noted in the report, I think, is that the state's master plan commitment to fund that enrollment has not kept pace. The audit report recommends that UC reduce out-of-state students to create more space for residents, but reducing non-residents would not enable UC to admit more California students. Non-residents support the entire cost of their education. California enrollment is limited or enabled, if you will, based on state funding to support that growth. Before the current budget, funding for California resident enrollment growth has not been provided for years. So simply eliminating non-residents will not by itself, of course, increase capacity for resident students. Now, the current admission cycle is a case in point. The legislature's approval last year of enrollment funding growth put in motion one of the largest enrollment ramp-ups in recent UC history. Last fall, the university announced its plans to enroll 5,000 more California students this year and another 5,000 in the next 2 years, assuming new enrollment growth funding to support these students is provided. And as you know, and as Nathan mentioned, this Monday the university reported that the admissions of 15% more California residents for the fall 16 term. Over the next several weeks, we will admit thousands more. The lesson here is simple. When the state supports enrollment growth, UC responds, and Californians benefit. I'd also like to point out that this year's enrollment growth will be concentrated at the 3 campuses that also enroll the most non-residents, Berkeley, UCLA, and San Diego. That's display 5, I believe, in the packet. If non-resident enrollment were the limiting factor in California enrollment, you would not expect to see new California enrollment focused at the campuses that also enroll the most out-of-state students. Second headline. Why is UC admitting less qualified non-residents when compared to California residents? Well, the simple answer is we don't. UC's admissions policy requires non-residents to be at least as qualified as admitted residents, holds non-residents to a higher minimum GPA simply to be considered, and provides no guarantee of admission to any out-of-state student. First of all, the audit report recommends a standard for admission of non-residents that represents, I think, a significant misreading of the master plan. Here's what the audit report says, page 47. The admission standard should require campuses to admit non-residents with admissions credentials that place them in the upper half of the residents it admits. But the audit report fails to recognize that the master plan language it cites was not intended to address campus-level admission, and was revised by the Legislative Master Plan Review Committee over a quarter of a century ago. The 1987 revision dropped the upper half of the eligibility pool language and instead stated that graduates of out-of-state secondary schools should be held to at least equivalent levels of preparation to those of Californians. This is the admission standard we follow. And I point out that this standard was reaffirmed by our own legislative analyst just 2 months ago. In its review of the governor's 2016-17 budget, the LAO states, quote, the master plan allows CSU and UC to admit non-resident students if these applicants meet similar academic standards as eligible public school graduates. Now, the audit report also contends that UC's academic senates compare favorably policy lowered standards for residents. The report says, page 25, in 2011, the university revised its admission standard for non-residents, making it easier for non-residents to gain admission. However, the documents we submitted during the audit review process show this conclusion to be inaccurate. UC's key faculty committee with responsibility for admissions policy, that would be the Board of Admissions and Relations with Schools, emphasized that its chief focus in revising this policy was to uphold the ideal of merit through comprehensive review processes over fiscal pressures to select non-residents over qualified California residents.